Sacred Heart is proud to sponsor Pensacola Histories in recognition of the Daughters of Charity who brought their mission of care to Pensacola over 90 years ago.
Hello and welcome to our continuing story of Pensacola, North America's first place city. And today we continue the story of the great lumbering era, which began in Pensacola effectively about 1870 and would be a part of our economic life here for half a century. Last time we talked a little bit about how lumbering began here, how the needs in Europe suddenly generated a huge demand for fresh lumber, and that this area of northwest Florida, South Alabama, was actually a 125 square mile forest of huge virgin yellow pine trees, perfect lumber source for the market that was developing. And of course, the first mill that was operational here, the big one anyway, belonged to the Simpson family, but it could hardly touch the huge demand that suddenly came upon this area for cut lumber, and also not only cut lumber but also for cut timber. We might need to talk about that for just a moment. We normally figure that a tree is cut in the forest, brought to a mill, and is shaped into the finished lumber product, shaped and planed and so forth, and then delivered to the customer. Well, generally that is true, but in the era that we're talking about, a substantial part of the material that was sent to Europe was shipped as timber. And basically the formula that the lumbermen had, the timbermen had, was that they would cut these huge trees in the forest and they would cut them into 16-foot lengths. And some of those lengths were brought as they were to the rivers or to the port, and they then put on board ship and sent to Europe in that form so that the mills there could do their own finishing. Now, we need to talk a little bit about lumbering itself, because it became not only an industry here, but it also was a great profession. Now, for centuries, people have been cutting down trees and shaping it into lumber. And basically, in the beginning of the period that we're talking about, the technique was very difficult. Basically, what would happen was this. A timber would be brought to the mill, and it would be placed in a spot where what they would have was I guess we would call it a track on which the log was laid. On one end of the track would be a man who would literally, well, actually probably more than one man, their job was to keep pressure on that log. Then that log was approaching a pit. Now, down in the bottom of the pit might be about 4 feet deep, down in the bottom of the pit was one man, and on the top of the pit was a second. And each man had one end of a saw, a huge saw, and they would move up and down from above and below. And of course, these jobs got names, got titles, and a man who was down in working down in the hole, down in the pit, logically, his job became pit man. And the man who was up at the top, who was working the top of the saw, he became the sawyer. So if you have friends named Pittman or Sawyer, well, you have a pretty good idea of where those names originated hundreds and hundreds of years ago. That was basically the original way. By the time we get into the period that we're talking about, power had been harnessed to a circular saw. And that was basically what the Simpsons had used over at Pond Creek. They had dammed up the creek and created the water pressure, which turned a mill wheel, which in turn turned the wheels of a mechanism which ran the circular saw. And when they transferred to the Blackwater, they were using steam power to use pulleys and belts to run the apparatus which turned the saw. So basically, this is the technique which we were using as the lumbering era began here. Now, we mentioned before that mills began to spring up all over the area, and they did. One of the largest ones, of course, was the organization that began at what we called, and we still call today, Bay Point on the Blackwater River. This was started by a family of Italian men who were very much experienced in lumbering. They had come here from Italy with capital, and they built this huge mill with its own town. Now, we have to understand, of course, that as all of this began, the great majority of land in the area here was owned either by the state or by the federal government. And people were able to either lease it or buy it very, very inexpensively. So the philosophy of a mill was basically get control of as much land as you possibly can, filled with pine trees, and we would work out an arrangement. We would move in with our teams, cut here, cut it almost completely, clear cut it, and then we'd move on to where the next group of trees would be. Well, that was, of course, if in today's view of environmentalism, this was absolutely the worst possible thing they could have done, but that was the most economical way to do it, and since land was cheap, people didn't care. They operated in that way. Now, as they cut the trees, of course, they fell in the forest, and you had to get them to the mill. And let me just give you a few of the ideas of how they work. At first, of course, they use the obvious way. They use teams of oxen. Sometimes it was 2, sometimes 4, sometimes as many as 6 oxen to a team. And the oxen were literally under the control of one man, a herder who became the shepherd of these animals and took care of them. And the relationship between a team leader and his animals was very close. And the oxen worked very well. Now, by the time when you began to move a little bit farther away from the mill, doing it that way was hauling by oxen was very difficult. And so the next choice that the mills had was to locate timber along streams so that they would be able to cut the timber, maybe use the oxen to carry it from the fell site to the water itself, and then float the timber down the stream to a river such as the Escambia or the Blackwater, then float the timber down that way to the mill or to a place where some form of transport such as a tugboat could pick it up and carry it. The stream worked fine. Now, after a time, of course, you ran out of streams. Most woods didn't have a superabundance of them. So they developed another way of doing something, which was called a flume. Now, a flume basically was a trough that was dug perhaps 4 to 5 feet deep. And then it was lined with boards, and they would be supplied with water, usually from a spring. And they would collect water. They would sort of dam it up at one point, put the cut logs in the flume, open the dam, and then the logs would flow down the flume to a stream, from the stream to the river, and so forth, repeating the process. And all of that was the way things were done pretty much up until the latter part of the 1880s. And at that point in time, it was possible to begin what we today call logging railroads. This was a time when the commercial railroads, of course, were expanding their equipment to getting larger and more powerful engines, locomotives, and they were willing to sell the smaller, older ones to the lumbering people. But obviously the need was so great that several of the great locomotive builders, such as Baldwin, began to make a specialty type of engine that was smaller, powerful, just the perfect thing for use in the forest. And so a lumbering company would operate a logging railroad more or less this way. They would have a line that would run, let's say, from the lumber mill to site number 1, where they would run the track there. The railroad would operate from point A to point B. Now we've run out of timber there, so now they tear up the track and move it to point C over here, so that now they can load the timbers on the cars and carry from there. And they literally move the railroad all over. And some of these railroads became very, very large. For example, the Simpson Railroad at its height had over 200 miles of track running back and forth to various places where they could carry timber from the cutting site into the mill. And many of the others, such as T.R. Miller and the Southern States Lumber Company, also had huge railroad systems, so large that at times they would be able to work out systems allied with the commercial railroad, such as the L&N, so that the logging railroad would have permission upon a proper schedule to run their trains over the regular system of the commercial line. It was that complex. At one time or another, over the history of logging railroads, the state of Alabama alone had over 300 different companies that had a logging railroad. Now, some of them were small, some large, and the logging railroads continued to be used effectively up until about 1940. At that time, of course, modern technology and motor trucks came along, and that was when the truck gradually replaced the idea of the railroad. Now, of course, the next thing we had to do, of course, was to take care of how we're going to move the timber away from Pensacola or the lumbering area here to Europe. That, of course, had to be done by deep-sea vessels and by a mechanism that just sort of evolved naturally, I guess. The lumbering people were very fortunate that at the time all of this began, in 1870, a number of the Scandinavian countries had an excess of shipping. These were sailing vessels, 400 to 500 tons, that would, on contract, would come to Pensacola. They would sail in ballast, come here, dump the ballast rock here, pick up their cargo of lumber and take it back to whatever port had to accommodate the customer there. Now, we think of these things as small, but we have to remember that there are some wonderful pictures today that show us how big the shipping industry became. By the time we reached 1885, we have some wonderful photographs and artwork that was done of Pensacola Harbor. And the average month in all of these years, month after month, year after year, between 50 and 60 ships per month were arriving here to load cargo. And of course, these vessels were small, and and handling techniques in those days were very different than they are today. So a ship of this kind would come, it would have to discharge its ballast, then it would have to be serviced. The seams would have to be caulked, all of the supplies would have to be renewed, and it would take that, by the time the loading was complete, that vessel would have been in Pensacola anywhere from 3 to 4 weeks. So you had a surge of seamen here all the time, and of course that was a bonanza to all of the downtown merchants, because these men, while most of them lived aboard ship, they were in the town doing and buying all sorts of things that made for a boost in the economy. At this point in time, just as an example, we had a major change in the idea of where people would stay when they came to Pensacola, whether they were seamen or people in the lumbering business itself. We had, first of all, by the time you got to 1885, there were more than 50 boarding houses in Pensacola that would take care of people for overnight or for a week or a month. This is one of those places where you got your room and your board in one package. And then, of course, they were very inexpensive by our standards today. And by the time we reached the 1870s, the first of the true hotels began to be formed here in Pensacola, and this, of course, developed into another industry in its own. By the time we got to the late 1880s, very nice hotels with very fine dining rooms, of course, were gracing the downtown area, and things were just, the whole idea of it was just improving greatly. Now, you've got this whole waterfront area that begins to develop as a service to shipping. Now, first of all, of course, you had to have docks, and we had from the beginning, we had the Pensacola or the Palafox Street Wharf, and then as the Wright Lumber Company and the Robinson Company developed their arrangements, they built docks of their own at the foot of 12th Avenue, at the foot of 14th Avenue, and the ships arriving to serve them docked right there. But many of the ships literally anchored in the bay, and they would be served with the lumber coming out on barges, which the little barges they called lighters. The tugboats would position them beside the vessels, and the longshoremen working on the decks would haul that lumber on board, put it in the holds, or in some cases they would put it on as stowed deck stowed lumber. And these vessels, they were running back and forth all the time. The tugboat industry alone had become very large, because you had to position these ships, you had to move them back and forth, you had to bring the lighters in, bring the lighters out, and the little steam tugs were just going back and forth, like little water bugs all the time, and it was a great industry unto itself, run by the Aiken family and the Bars family and some of the others. Now, to handle all of the arrangements, to make sure that all of the pieces came together, they had what they call shipping agents. These were companies that dealt with the customer in Europe, with the supplier here, with the ship in the middle, and then making all of the arrangements that were necessary while the ship was here for supplies, for medical care, whatever it was required, and these became known as shipping agents. There were a substantial number of them, but the largest one of all was owned by a man named Henry Bars. Now, Henry Bars was a unique man. Had come here had come to the United States at age 16. He had served in the Confederate Army and had worked for a similar agency in Savannah, Georgia, and came to Pensacola in 1870 with his young wife and settled in. And by the time he was at the end of his career, his company was serving 65 different mills, taking care of their lumber exports, and they were shipping lumber not just to Europe, but also to 4 other continents. Bars became a huge part of the economic industry here, and we'll be talking about him again when we cover some of the other areas of Pensacola, our history, in other episodes.